Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Perhaps I should emphasise at the outset that I am the honorary ambassador for Antarctica, ambassador for Tasmania. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade get a little bit concerned when people swan around calling themselves ambassadors, so I'm the honorary ambassador. I'd like to add my welcome to you all to this planning workshop. And I would like to extend a special welcome to all our visitors from outside Tasmania. I know that you're here to do important work, but I do hope that while you're here, you do find some time to enjoy some of the many attractions which this city and this state have to offer. Given that Tasmania's connections with Southern Ocean voyages and Antarctic expeditions go back some 185 years, and that Tasmania's most southerly point, Macquarie Island, is located at 55 degrees south, right in the heart of SOOS territory, and given Hobart's standing as a most significant centre of Antarctic research and Southern Ocean research. I was going to say the most significant in the world, but my wife tells me I should at least try and be a bit modest about Tasmania's assets. I don't think that you could find a more appropriate home, given those connections, for the SOOS International Project Office, or a better venue for this workshop than this building and this institute in this city. The journey which has brought SOOS to this workshop has been remarkable. The precursors to SOOS go back quite a long way. I think one of the main ones was the work of Matthew Maury, a 19th century United States scientist and one of the founders of the science of oceanography, who was convinced of the great influence which the Southern Ocean had on the oceans and the atmosphere of the rest of the world. But the ramifications of his insights were not appreciated until relatively recently, when the extent to which Southern Ocean processes influence climate and biogeochemical cycles, sea levels and biological productivity on a global scale became fully realised. In other words, it became clear that the Southern Ocean was not like Las Vegas. What happens in the Southern Ocean does not stay in the Southern Ocean, it goes around the world. The first substantial response to this realisation was in 1991, when an international conference entitled Antarctic Science Global Concerns was held in Bremen under the auspices of one of the major sponsors of SOOS, SCAR, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. Now, the purpose of that conference was to foster awareness of the intimate connections which exist between the Southern Ocean and the oceans and the atmosphere of the rest of the globe, and its corresponding influence on the environment in which we live. But although it was a high-quality, productive conference which influenced scientific thinking, it didn't have a great impact on policymakers, and it didn't have a great impact on the allocation of research funds. But it was a start, and eventually the significance of research into Southern Ocean systems became fully appreciated. But that then led to the realisation, as you know, of the inadequacy of the data available to undertake that research. Available time series were short and incomplete, and repositories of Southern Ocean data were fragmented, had limited quality control and were difficult to access. So it was concluded that sustained multidisciplinary observations were required to detect and interpret Southern Ocean processes and enable society to respond to the consequences of changes in them. Now, I know most of you all know most of that history, but it's worth just reminding ourselves of it at the beginning of this workshop. And of course, in order to supply those deficiencies, SOOS came into existence in August 2011 when its International Project Office was officially opened here at this Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies. Since then, SOOS has achieved an impressive set of milestones which are set out in the volume you may have been able to pick up today. But if you look through that book, you'll find that it includes setting up an international governance structure, drawing on people and organisations and resources from 12 nations, and taking SOOS well down the track of implementing its objectives by, amongst other things, defining a list of candidates for classification as essential ocean variables, supporting the development of new observation technologies, developing a Southern Ocean metadata portal, implementing a comprehensive communication strategy, and building a network, a truly impressive network of no fewer than 36 affiliated international institutes, programs or organisations. Now, it's no wonder that the co-chairs of SOOS, Professor Oscar Schofield and Associate Professor Anna Wallen, have expressed themselves, and I quote, as awed by the sheer force and speed with which the initiative is moving forward. But I think that as well as the concrete objectives defined in its strategic plan, there is another more general but very significant dimension to the mission and the work of SOOS. Now, it's commonplace to note the accelerating trend to specialisation in science, a trend which started becoming evident as long ago as the mid-19th century, when the publication of journals covering general science began to be overwhelmed by single discipline science journals. And related but more recent developments have been that the objectives of research projects tend to be more tightly constrained, and there's difficulty in obtaining funding for programs entailing monitoring, data collection, analysis and research, which extend over periods longer than the usual funding cycles for individual or institutional research grants. Now, in part, these trends are, of course, understandable and they're unavoidable. They're simply the inevitable result of successful research creating more and more knowledge, which can only be accommodated by breaking it down into more and more subdivisions. But it does have a downside, because it can lead to research silos, and it can militate against the sort of advances in understanding which come from large-scale, long-term, multidisciplinary observations and research, which can reveal unexpected connections between different classes of phenomena. But running through the modern history of science, there has been a healthy countervailing movement. It started with a style of science which became known as Humboldtian science, originally inspired by the great naturalist and geographer and science communicator and expeditioner Alexander von Humboldt. It then took on a life of its own. It was an approach which was methodologically rigorous, but recognised the limitations of the specialisation in science which was emerging in the 19th century. It placed emphasis on observations using the latest instruments, constructed maps of isolines connecting points with the same values, identified large, even global fields of investigation, connected and demonstrated the interdependence of different types of large-scale phenomena, and used international organisational structures to make local observations as part of a global program. Now, an early example of Humboldtian science was what became known as the Magnetic Crusade, which entailed taking geomagnetic observations all around the world through a chain of fixed magnetic observatories with standardised instruments using standardised methods of observation. And one of those observatories was the Rossbank Observatory, which is the observatory that you can see in the picture on the screens behind me. That was established by James Clark Ross in 1840 on what are now the grounds of Government House in Hobart. No trace of it remains except a little plaque on the ground, but that's a picture painted by Thomas Bock at the time. The people in the trio, the man in the middle is James Clark Ross, and on the left is Sir John Franklin. Now, that was Australia's first physics project, and I believe Australia's first global scientific project of any discipline. Now, the effort, and this is the important lesson to learn from this, the effort put into the Magnetic Crusade project was soon vindicated by the new knowledge which it created, including Edward Sabine's discovery of the correlation between sunspot activity and deviations in the Earth's magnetic phenomena, which of course he learnt about through the worldwide survey. And from that he demonstrated the existence of the 11-year sunspot cycle. But none of that could have happened had he not had the data from those observatories. Now, that demonstration of the connection between phenomena observed by geophysicists and astronomers was a fine example of the creative potential of large-scale multidisciplinary science. And that sort of approach is also epitomised by Antarctic science, which has a generalised and multidisciplinary character, which is in sharp contrast to the tendency to narrowness and specialisation found in much of the rest of science. Now, of course, individual Antarctic scientists are just as skilled, just as specialised as scientists generally, but at the same time, they seem to still manage to maintain a broad perspective extending well beyond their own particular fields. Now, the same philosophy inspired the 3 International Polar Years and the great 1957 International Geophysical Year. So at the same time as it's pursuing its particular mission of observing and creating and disseminating knowledge about the Southern Ocean, the work of SOOS is also adding another chapter to that great tradition in the history of science. The planning workshop commencing this evening and continuing for the next 2 days represents a pivotal stage in the history of SOOS. It takes it, as you know, into the full-scale implementation stage of its strategy. I think that the workshop comprises a well-balanced program, starting with presentations about current topics, including ecosystem change, sea ice, warming in West Antarctica and the sensitivity of the Southern Ocean to climate change. It then moves on to discussions about priorities and field capabilities and concludes by taking us to the vanguard of the SOOS project with sessions on the implementation of its 5-year strategic plan and the setting up of working groups. I think that it's a very well-structured, logical tier of sessions, which I think is really, in a sense, a microcosm of the admirable way in which SOOS has approached its development over the last 3 years. And I'm sure that it's going to prove just as productive. It's with great pleasure that I declare open the planning workshop implementation of a Southern Ocean observing system.